it's all coming through.
Perfect. So my name's Kayla and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Health Sciences, but based at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. And my research focuses on outcome measures for children with neuromuscular diseases. So today I'm just going to be talking to you about the need to accurately measure gait and function outside of the clinic or hospital environment to evaluate a patient's real-world gait. So this is particularly important as disease-modifying treatments become available for these kids, as we really want to evaluate the effectiveness in their day-to-day lives. I'm just going to quickly outline the problem and then go over 2 studies that I'm working on, aiming to come up with kind of some initial solutions for this problem, but there's definitely a lot more that could be done. Could use some engineering help. All right, so over the past few decades, researchers have developed valid, reliable, and sensitive ways to assess gait and function in clinic. So the current gold standard to evaluate gait is 3-dimensional gait analysis, or 3DGA. However, clinical trials in neuromuscular diseases tend to rely on functional measures such as the 6-minute walk test or disease-specific functional scales. However, all of these measures require visits to the hospital and trained evaluators to administer them, so they can be both time-consuming and expensive for the hospital. Further, the frequent visits to the hospital for clinical trials become burdensome for the families. So to try and reduce this burden, a need for real-world assessments that can be done at home has been identified. And just due to the continuing impact of COVID-19 on our day-to-day lives, the ability to reliably and accurately monitor gait and function in the community will be a huge benefit. So as I mentioned, 3DGA is currently the gold standard for measuring gait. However, there are significant cost and space requirements for setting up these labs, so not all hospitals can have one. And the true expense is really in staffing these labs, as each assessment takes a few hours to complete, and then there's significant time involved in processing and interpreting all of the data that you get. There's also some concern that in these labs, patients perform, as we call, their doctor walking or physio walking. So although this is a measure of their best ability, it may not accurately reflect their day-to-day ambulation. So although this data from 3-dimensional gait analysis is essential for things like surgical decision-making, it's really not going to be feasible in large clinical trials. So the first study that I'm going to talk to you about is in a disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. So this is a progressive peripheral neuropathy that's characterized by weakness, sensory loss, and foot deformities. So as it's a length-dependent neuropathy, the distal muscles, so the hands and feet, are affected first and to the greatest extent. So because of this, these children often have gait difficulties. So the Inherited Neuropathies Consortium, which is a group of international researchers that we're part of, has developed sensitive and responsive clinical outcome assessments across the lifespan, which are conducted during in-person study visits, and they will be essential for future clinical trials. However, there has been an increasing interest from both pharmaceutical companies and regulatory bodies, such as the FDA, to include real-world and digital biomarker assessments in any clinical trials. So even prior to COVID kind of forcing us to think about this, we did receive a large NIH grant to evaluate the effectiveness of these measures for gait and balance. So the first aim of our study is just to understand real-world physical activity and gait in children with CMT. Based on the data from our gait lab, it was suggested that more responsive outcome measures might include specific gait parameters such as step length, stride velocity, and things like this. So as a secondary aim, we're also evaluating the use of wearable sensors as digital biomarkers of these gait and balance parameters. So to address the first aim, we're using the Actigraph Activity Monitor. Now this is the most widely used physical activity monitor, and it's both FDA and TGA approved, so it's easy to implement into clinical trials. We are optimistic that this will at least help us describe physical activity in children with CMT. However, we're still unsure if it will be sensitive enough to measure community-level gait, as its data is limited to things like step count, time spent at different activity levels, but it doesn't give us any specific details on many of the gait parameters that we're interested in. And further, the sensitivity of this measure for individuals with atypical gait patterns that are often seen in neuromuscular diseases has not been evaluated yet. For the second aim, we're using something called the Ambulatory Parkinson's Disease Mobility System, which is a sensitive measure of gait parameters as well as balance through the measurement of sway. So as you can see on the graph shown at the bottom, So this is a patient who looked to the naked eye like they were standing perfectly still with their eyes open while wearing these sensors. However, you can see from the black trace line that although they appeared to be still, the sensors were able to pick up the slight sway that they were having, which does fall outside of that normative gray band that you can see in the background there. The only issue with this device is that it does still require a docking station in clinic and an evaluator to administer some of these tests. So although it may provide us more sensitive data, it doesn't address our need to evaluate gait and balance outside of the hospital environment. So for the second study that I'm working on, it's in patients with spinal muscular atrophy. So this is a more severe neuromuscular disease with the two most common types having reduced life expectancy and neither achieve the ability to walk independently. So historically, measuring gait has not been a priority in this disease. However, with recent disease-modifying treatments and the ability to treat pre-symptomatically, patients who previously would have never walked are now starting to develop normally and walk as their peers would. So this little boy is 2 in this video. He has an older sister who never achieved the ability to walk. However, he received his first dose of nusinersen at 9 days of age. He walked at 12 months, which is completely normal. And as you can see now, he's climbing stairs and running around as he should be. So in collaboration with researchers at Columbia and Stanford University, as well as the Stevens Institute, who are evaluating the use of in-shoe sensors as a measure of gait in children with spinal muscular atrophy. So during the last few years when I was at Columbia University, we were working on developing these in-shoe sensors, which started out quite complicated, as you can see in the first picture, requiring receivers to be worn around the legs and waist, which really hindered kind of normal gait. However, the prototype has evolved to these thin, flexible in-shoe sensors that can be worn inside of your shoe with only a small receiver placed on the outside of your shoe. However, at the moment, we're still validating these measures against the in-clinic Xeno mats, which provides the same level of gait data, very similar to what you get from three-dimensional gait analysis. And at the time being, to calibrate these devices, we do still need some in-clinic measures of gait. So the aim of this study is really to develop and validate a novel calibration framework for these instrumented insoles, the goal of accurately estimating gait parameters without the need for in-clinic specific reference data to train the calibration models, which would allow them to then be used in the community. However, these aren't quite up to that stage yet, and the next challenge is that the battery life is quite limited to only a couple of hours just due to the volume of sensor information that we're trying to collect from them. And then lastly, new devices like this, of course, would need TGA, FDA, and other regulatory approval. So in summary, our team and international collaborators are currently trying to evaluate 3 wearable sensors to evaluate gait and balance. However, until the completion of these studies, the validity, sensitivity, and ability to even use in the community is still unclear. There's clearly a need for novel solutions to measure gait and balance in the community for children with neuromuscular diseases or gait impairments. Thank you.